When it comes to money and migration, are the government's promises quite what they appear? More and more people from abroad have made the UK their home. Net migration is the highest it's ever been, even though the Prime Minister says it's not what he really wants.
I'm very clear that the levels of migration are too high and they've got to come down to more sustainable levels.
Nor does Labour. Keir Starmer, chiming in, also says it's too high.
That figure is shockingly high, and it represents a failure not just of immigration but also of asylum and of the economy.
And the rows about who should live here even make it down under, miles away.
We cannot go on with the numbers coming to Britain that are coming. Do you know why?
I'm one of the numbers! Is now the right time for tax cuts, Chancellor?
We're paying more and more tax too, even though the Chancellor's big boast this week was cutting specific tax back, as well as claiming that public services will be protected. Even though there is a painful squeeze ahead, politicians have a lot of big problems to try to fix. But our main question this morning, are they being straight with you and me? We'll talk to two chiefs, the Tories' Chief Secretary to the Treasury, Laura Trott, who's with us for the first time. Her rival, Darren Jones for Labour, their Shadow Chief Secretary, joins us from Bristol too. Migration is on every leader's agenda. The Greek Prime Minister, Kyriakos Mitsotakis, is here to talk to us today before he gets together with Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer. And we'll take a journey through space and time with Doctor Who's companion and legendary comic, Catherine Tate. Whatever.
100%. It will always be, I'm sure, the best job I've ever had.
Really?
For 100%. I think David and I both feel that. It's 100% the best job.
Morning. With me at the desk today, Richard Tice, the leader of Reform UK, the party who fancies gobbling up the Tories' votes with the public sector squeeze on the cards, Christina McAnee, head of the mega union Unison, and with energy bills on the rise, Alistair Phillips-Davis, the boss of the energy firm SSE. Let's see what's making the news this morning on the front pages. The Sunday Times leading with the Israeli hostage release. In a second, we'll talk to Clive Myrie, who's on the ground where that's going on. But notice there too an intriguing story claiming Reform UK offered a prominent Tory cash to defect. The Sunday Mirror has a photograph of 9-year-old Emily Hans, who was released by Hamas yesterday. And they've spoken to her father, saying, "My darling girl is broken, but in one piece." We'll hear more about that in a second. The Observer also features the hostage returns, but a note on migration we'll touch on later, warning that curbing it would hit social care. The Sunday Express also goes on migration, but comes at it from a different angle, focusing on Tory MPs' concerns about channel crossings in small boats. And the images of the hostage releases are likely to dominate the news today. Take a look at this. It's so moving to watch. 9-year-old Irish-Israeli girl, Emily Hans, one of the group of hostages. You can see another family there too, being reunited. Now, you might have seen Emily's father being interviewed in the last couple of weeks by the BBC. Emily's now in a hospital in Tel Aviv where she's being checked over. Our colleague Clive Myrie is there and we can speak to him now. Clive, it must be quite an atmosphere there this morning. What is going on?
Yeah, well, I mean, just referring to those pictures, Laura, of Thomas and Emily together, I mean, it's astonishing. Remember, Thomas was told that Emily was dead as a result of the Hamas attack on October the 7th. He went through all the stages of grief, denial, acceptance, pain, and actually, when he was told that she was dead, he believed that that would be better for her rather than her being held hostage in Gaza. Then he was told 2 weeks later that actually they didn't have proof that she was dead, that in fact she was alive, and I spoke to him just after that. And of course the hope that he had and the rest of his family was that she would be returned, and that happened last night with those amazing pictures of the two of them hugging together. An incredible story, and a reunion that happened to 12 other families with 12 other hostages released yesterday. The second group of hostages to be released by Hamas over the last 2 days. And we know that the Israelis have already been given the list of 13 Israeli hostages that Hamas intends to release tonight if everything goes according to plan. And Emily is actually being evaluated here with some of the other hostages released yesterday here at the Sheba Hospital just behind me there. And the hope is that the deal will continue through to its allotted end point, which is in 4 days' time on Monday, and then possibly an extension for another 5 days. So a number of hostages released, in return also for Palestinian prisoners to be released from Israeli jails. The hope is that this can continue and that the pause in the fighting, allowing aid into Gaza, can also continue too.
Such hopes then for the families who have been so terribly affected by this. But Clive, what impact do you think good news for some families will actually have on the wider conflict? Does this pause make any longer-term difference to what's going on?
It's a really important question. At the moment, both sides are getting what they want. Hamas is getting a pause in the fighting, which is allowing aid into Gaza. It's also getting respite from the incessant bombing from Israel, so it's being able to regroup to a certain extent, and that's something that they wanted. The Israelis are getting what they want. They are getting some of their hostages back. But once the potential 9-day period is over and 50 Israeli hostages have been returned in exchange for 150 Palestinian prisoners, then what? The Israelis have already made it clear they want the destruction of Hamas, and they're not going to stop that, and they're going to continue to lay waste to certain areas where they believe Hamas fighters are hiding out. Hamas have made it clear, we know in their charter, that they want the destruction of Israel, and they're going to continue their campaign. So there is a respite for the moment, and that is welcomed by both parties here. But ultimately, it is likely the fighting will continue, despite the concerns of the international community that a disproportionate number of civilians are dying in Gaza as a result of Israel's campaign. So yes, while there is a respite at the moment, it's highly likely that we're going to see the fighting continue at some point in the future.
Clive, thank you so much. And of course, you can watch the coverage of these unfolding events from Clive and the rest of our BBC colleagues out in the Middle East for the rest of the day on BBC News. Let's then talk about some stories in the papers here at home this morning. Now, Richard, we've hinted there at an intriguing story in the Sunday Times, which claims that your party offered a huge amount of cash to a prominent Conservative, Lee Anderson, in order to defect. Now, they've got a secret recording, they say, of him saying that to Tory activists. What do you say to that claim?
Look, I'm very happy to confirm that I've had numerous discussions with a number of Tory MPs, ministers, former ministers, who are absolutely furious with the complete betrayal of the government's promises, furious with the failure to stop the boats, furious with opening the borders to mass immigration. Obviously, I will keep those discussions completely confidential, but let me make it absolutely clear. No cash or money has in any way been offered. What has been offered is the chance to change the shape of the debate. What's really happened here is that Lee Anderson has used the threat of defecting to Reform to negotiate himself the deputy chairmanship of the Tory party, because this story first appeared almost exactly the same in the Times back in February, when coincidentally he was made deputy chairman of the Tory party.
Well,
that's what's happened.
Murky events, and Mr Anderson isn't here to defend himself, but you've made your position clear. But I'm interested, and we might come back to it later. You say you've had conversations with numbers of MPs and also ministers about maybe former ministers about maybe. Well, maybe we'll pick up on that a bit later. But we're going to talk a lot today about migration, and we will speak to you about that later. But Alistair, we had this huge number this week. Record levels of people coming here perfectly legally. And it's often the fact that businesses say, we need this, the economy needs this. Is that the case? Is that true?
So it's obviously a huge political debate at the moment. I think businesses do need skills, but I think they are in specific areas. For us, and certainly in the energy sector that I operate in, we're putting huge amounts of effort in with government to retraining people, taking people from the oil and gas sector, bringing them into new industries, renewable industries as well. So I think in certain areas, but clearly I don't think we need all of the numbers that are perhaps being talked about.
And if you train people, then maybe you don't have to bring them in from abroad. That's an interesting point. Christina, the health service and social care in particular is right now really reliant on migration. We can see that in the numbers, it's crystal clear. But what do you think it would take to change that?
It would take a pretty long-term strategy, particularly around care. There has never been a proper, any people planned for the care sector. It's just been allowed, the government just crosses its fingers and hopes things will happen. So there would need to be a proper plan for how you would train people, how you would recruit people. It's predominantly based on minimum wage. It's not seen as a particularly attractive job, and there's no proper structure where people are recognised for the different skills they bring to it.
Okay, so a big challenge. We'll come back to these issues later once we've talked to the government minister, because last week we spoke to the Chancellor and he was coy about his big plans for the autumn statement. But on Wednesday, he boasted of tax cuts that he spelled out, but alongside a penciled-in public spending squeeze to pay for it in the years to come. But those headlines were quickly replaced with some alarm at levels of migration that broke the records. Not concern over stop the boat, small channel crossings that's used up so much political oxygen, but the numbers of people coming to the country perfectly legally with the government's permission. The Prime Minister said again, the numbers must come down, but I think we've heard that before.
Net migration needs to come down radically from hundreds of thousands a year to just tens of thousands.
We're all committed to what we said in the Conservative Party manifesto, which was that we were going to bring net migration down to sustainable levels, and that means not the hundreds of thousands that we've seen in recent decades.
Get Brexit done, and then we really do take back control of our immigration policy for everybody around the world.
So I want to bring the levels of legal migration down. Let me be crystal clear about that.
Well, Laura Trott, the brand new Chief Secretary, a fortnight into her job, is here now. Welcome to the studio for the first time, Laura.
Thank you for having me.
Now, the former Minister, Jacob Rees-Mogg, said this week that you have failed on immigration and he has apologised to the public. Should you do the same?
Look, the Prime Minister has acknowledged that the levels of migration are too high, they're not sustainable. The ONS has said that they are coming down, which is positive news, but we are taking further steps, including in May, one of the biggest measures to cut migration ever, which is about limiting the number of student dependents that can come over.
And that's something that has already been announced by the government that may or may not make some difference. But I just want to emphasise the scale of this. Look at the figure, 672,000 people added to the population. That's like adding the city of Glasgow, or nearly as many as adding the city of Leeds to the country. And this is not something that has happened by accident. This is happening under your watch, under the way that government policy has been built up. And I want to show people what it means in the breakdown. Let's look at the three biggest groups. We've got there students, 643,000 people, care workers, 101,000 people, nurses, 23,000. So you've said clearly it has to come down. Who don't you want to come?
Well, I can talk through each of the individual measures there. So the Prime Minister is clear we're taking long-term decisions on each of these. So on students, he made the announcement in May that we're limiting the number of dependents that students can bring over. That comes in from January. On care workers and nurses, we introduced a long-term plan for NHS workforce, which will mean that we're training more people in this country to do those jobs.
Long-term, you've said on both of those things, these are long-term decisions. You've already had the long-term. You've had 13 years, and this is what's happened.
Yeah, I mean, I think outside of these specific numbers, in the last couple of years, there have been unique circumstances. We've seen that with Ukraine, we've seen that with Hong Kong. I think everyone listening at home would have supported us bringing those people over.
But the biggest change that we've seen this week is in terms of the numbers of people coming here to work.
Yep.
That is what all of the evidence shows. And if we look at one sector, let's look at care. If we look at the numbers of care workers in March 2022, that's when visas started being granted, because the holes in the care service were so big, we had to appeal to people from abroad. Now it's up at 30,000 being approved every quarter.
And that is why this year we brought forward a £600 million plan to train more people to do social care in this country. So we are taking concrete steps. I'm not just saying here, I want it to come down. I'm saying that we are taking concrete steps to bring it down.
But how quickly is any of that going to make a difference?
Well, we think, so if you look at what we did in the autumn statement just this week, the measures that we've taken will increase the number of people working domestically by over 70,000. The steps that we took in the spring budget are 100,000. So we're increasing the size of the British workforce, as well as taking steps to make sure that we're limiting any abuse or exploitation of the system.
A lot of people might not know this, but at the moment it is government policy to allow bosses to pay foreign workers 20% less if British staff are thin on the ground. And do you think it's okay to allow businesses to undercut British workers like that?
Look, what the Prime Minister at the moment is looking at all measures to make sure that we bring this level down, because that is what we're committed to do.
I don't want to
point in any specific measures at this point, but what I can point to is concrete steps that we have already taken that will bring these numbers down, and we will act to tackle abuse or exploitation of the system.
There is so much exasperation in your own party about this. The former Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, says that you should look at a cap. We understand the Immigration Minister himself, Robert Jenrick, might not be far behind. He wants you to be tougher in all of this. Is there one measure that you can tell us about today that is not something that's already been announced that you're actually going to step? There are plenty of ideas around. Boris Johnson wants you to put the salary threshold up. Labour wants you to get rid of that 20% discount rate we were just talking about. Can you tell us one step you will take?
What you've asked me rightly when these things are going to come in, and I have pointed out that we have made steps already this year, both earlier in the year in terms of cranking down on the numbers, but also this week in terms of increasing the workforce in the UK. And you just had the discussion on the panel about that being really vital. Us having specific concrete steps to increase the number of workers we've got domestically.
Can you tell us
to fill these
today
jobs
about new measures that you are going to take in the light of these recent figures?
Well, we took plenty of measures this week.
Well, they don't appear to be working.
Well, no, but they were only announced this week in terms of making sure that we are increasing the domestic workforce to fill these types of jobs.
The funny thing about talking to Conservative politicians like you about this is when you talk about migration, it's somehow as if this is something that just happened, rather than this being the product of decisions that you have made over the years. You have control on this. You've had control of this since we left the EU. And since we left the EU, the numbers have gone through the roof.
So the nature of it has changed over time. We introduced a points-based system, you're totally right, after we left the EU. I think that was the right thing to do. We have seen a large number come over as a result of Ukraine and Hong Kong. We talked about that earlier. I think that was the right decision. And now we're doing more so we can control the number of people coming over by limiting the number of student dependents, by having a long-term NHS workforce plan. These are things that are concrete.
Years to make
no,
a
they
difference.
are things that will start to make a difference. It was announced earlier this year. It will start to make a difference. It's really important that people see we are not only talking about this, but taking concrete steps to address it.
Well, that's exactly the point, isn't it? And I think a lot of viewers might have seen our little tape there of successive Conservative Prime Ministers making a promise to bring things down, and then they know the numbers have gone up. That's exactly the point, isn't it? You want people to have confidence that the steps you'll take will make a difference. But looking at the record, people would not be forgiven for thinking that those promises are not worth the paper they're written on.
But this is also a complex problem that changes over time. If you think about, so illegal migration is part of this. It's not the total amount, but it's part of this. If you think about, we had a lot of people 10 years ago coming in through the Channel Tunnel. That was stopped.
We're talking about people coming here to work perfectly legally.
But the illegal migration is part of these figures as well, obviously, because there are people coming over here. And we are absolutely determined to stop the boats and stop that happening. But this was something that wasn't an issue 5 years ago.
We should remind our viewers that that is a fraction of the number when we're talking about the overall thing. But you're right to say it's a complicated picture. Let's talk about something else that came out this week. Now, the Chancellor was boasting about big tax cuts that he's made and claiming he can protect public services. But when the independent number crunchers, the IFS, took a look at this, this is how they described the reality of your cuts to national insurance. These changes give back less than £1 of every £4 that's being taken away from households through changes to national insurance and income tax announced since March 2021. So isn't it then, in the simplest of terms, a bit misleading for your boss, the Chancellor, to say, fantastic, we've given everyone a big tax cut, when what you're doing is giving people £1 back when you've already taken £4 away?
No, and let me explain why. So you're right to point out that this was a big tax-cutting fiscal event. It will mean that someone on an average wage is £450 better off as a result of our national insurance cuts. Now, I don't shy away from the fact that we've had to take some very difficult decisions to pay back our COVID debt and the money we spent on supporting people's energy bills. But because of those decisions, we've managed to halve inflation, we've done it in a non-inflationary way, and now the economy has turned a corner. And I contrast that to the Labour Party, who refuse to take any of these difficult decisions, say we shouldn't have had to pay back COVID debt,
but I'm asking
supporting
about
us in raising
your
taxes,
decisions.
And then
we'll
also
talk to Labour later in the programme.
I know, and it's very important that they are clear about the fact that they are borrowing £28 billion, which will push up the cost of mortgages for families.
It's very important that you are clear about the overall picture here.
Yeah.
The overall picture for our viewers is that the tax burden is going up and up and up.
That's actually not true for people on average wages. Their taxes would have been cut by about £1,000 on average since 2010. For some of the highest earners, we have asked them to take on more of a burden. I think that's a reasonable thing.
Since 2010, you know, and our viewers will have seen and heard on many occasions, taxes are going to reach a post-war high. The overall tax burden is going up. Shouldn't you just be straight with people?
I am being straight that if you are on an average income, because of the changes that we've made, your tax burden will have gone down quite significantly. Right? We have been very open about the fact if you are on some of the highest wages, we have asked you to take more of the burden. That is a policy decision that we have taken. But the overall direction now, we have turned a corner. We are going to bring taxes down, but we're going to do it in a non-inflationary way, and that is really important.
Well, you are going to bring some taxes down, but the overall tax burden is going up. I want people to understand that clearly. But there's an important point too, because you've made the decision to give some tax back by penciling in big cuts to public spending in the years to come.
No, not. So public spending, so it's gone up by 3% since 2019, just over 3%. It's going to go up by 1% in real terms up to 2028, post-25, in the next Parliament. Now, that is a rise in public spending. It will mean that the amount we're spending on public spending is £85 billion higher in real terms than it was in 2019.
But again, and that is about the total overall, because some parts of the public purse are protected, like hospitals and schools, but there are penciled in cuts of a huge amount of money to parts of the public purse that are not protected, whether that's councils or courts and prisons. Surely you must acknowledge that that is the case.
So these are policy decisions, and we will set them out in our next manifesto as to how we are spending the money, but the total of the amount of money we are spending is going up, and it's very important that people at home recognise that.
Yeah, which is not the same as it going up across government, but these are complicated areas, and it's great to have you with us in the studio this morning. So new into your job as Chief Secretary, just before we let you go, as someone who's now in charge of looking at the government spreadsheets, are you good at managing your own finances? Are you someone who pays your bills on time?
I am, of course, somebody who pays my bills on time, but no, I've got an economics background. I've just come from a pensions job, so this is a dream job for me, and I'm delighted to be doing it.
Dreaming of spreadsheets. Laura Trott, thank you very much indeed for coming into the studio. It's great to have you with us for the first time, and I'm sure we'll see you soon. What did you think of what the Chief Secretary had to say? You can let us know by email at kuenssberg@bbc.co.uk. The address is there for you now. Or if you're social media inclined, you can use the hashtag #BBCLauraK, and we will share some of your thoughts towards the end of the show. And as ever, you can follow the story as it unfolds on the website too, bbc.co.uk. Now, the UK is not alone in struggling with its economy and grappling with the numbers of people who want to make Europe their new home. Not so long ago, Greece was groaning under enormous debt and trying to cope with many, many thousands of people arriving on its shores. But the man often credited with turning around its economy, who was rewarded with a thumping majority in the summer elections, is Prime Minister Kyriakos Mitsotakis, who I'm delighted to say is with us this morning. Welcome to the programme.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
It's a very great pleasure. Now, like the UK, Greece has had to grapple with migrants arriving on its shores, but you have really cut the numbers. And not so long ago, Suella Braverman, who was the Home Secretary until recently, visited Samos in the Aegean Sea, and she said she felt the UK had a lot to learn from Greece. So do you think there are things we have to learn from you?
Well, we've implemented a tough but fair migration policy, which starts with the fundamental premise that you need to limit the number of boats leaving the Turkish shore. We've been able to do that rather successfully. Granted, our geography is very different to yours, so maybe some analogies may not be that relevant. But we've been able to significantly reduce the number of people arriving on the Greek islands, which of course is a big relief for our island population. And we've also been very successful in processing asylum applications relatively quickly. So I'd say overall, we've changed the narrative of migration, and we've also convinced Europe that you cannot manage the migration problem unless you place particular emphasis on what we call the external dimension of migration, which is essentially protecting our common borders.
And if you look at the numbers, I mean, they are astonishing. In 2015, you had more than 800,000 people arriving. The latest figures are now down to 35,000 so far this year. But part of the way that you handled it was an EU-wide deal with Turkey. Now, the UK has struggled to get a returns deal with France, and outside the EU, that might be quite tricky. Do you think it's realistic that the EU would actually try to help the UK with this?
Well, look, in our case, we want to work with Turkey. Turkey is a country of transit, and we do so both bilaterally, but also within the context of the European Union. It seems to me that you have a different type of a problem. When I was looking at the numbers, as a significant number of the people who arrive in the UK arrive through legal pathways. And what we're saying in Europe is that you need to contain the problem of irregular arrivals while at the same time offering legal pathways to migration. If you look at the Greek economy, for example, we're looking for more, for example, agricultural workers. The economy is growing. Unemployment is under 10% for the first time in many, many years. So we need to balance protecting our borders with offering legal pathways to migration and, of course, returning those who are not granted asylum to their countries of origin. This has proven to be very tricky, not just for the UK, it's also proven to be very tricky for Europe because we need to cooperate with these countries and they're not always particularly forthcoming.
They're not always willing to do so. But there's also some criticism from charities and from other refugee groups that the approach that Greece has taken has sometimes been too harsh and too strict, and you've been too tough to get the numbers down. Now, in the summer, there was an overcrowded boat carrying migrants and it capsized and hundreds of people died. There's the boat there, if people, I'm sure, will remember the news story. Now, your Coast Guard has come under real pressure over the way that it was handled. They claimed the boat was on a safe and steady course. Some of our colleagues at the BBC found that the boat actually had hardly moved in the hours before then. And the BBC's also verified some footage that shows that the Coast Guard filmed the boat foundering at sea during the time that the authorities claim it wasn't in need of rescue. There's been a lot of controversy around this, but do you accept now that your Coast Guard got some things wrong?
We're investigating this particular incident, but what I would like to point out, Laura, is that our Coast Guard has saved tens of thousands of people at sea, and we should be grateful for the work they do. At the same time, I've been very open and forthcoming that we feel that we have a right to intercept boats at sea and at the same time encourage these boats to return to the coast from where they left. When you look at this boat, the tragedy is that this boat left the coast of Libya in the first place. And that is why it is so important to work with the countries of transit. It is very difficult, you just look at this photo, to do a lot about an overcrowded boat. We asked the boat whether they wanted assistance. They refused any assistance. They wanted to get to Italy. And at the end of the day, we should hold the smugglers accountable, not the Coast Guard that is trying to do its job.
But even the Council of Europe has expressed concern about what happened, about the actions that were taken by the Greek Coast Guard. Do you think they might have got some things wrong?
What I'm saying is that this incident is being investigated, and it's also investigated by Greek justice. And I will leave it at that. But again, it's important to point the finger at the smugglers because they're, at the end of the day, are the ones responsible for offering people what many desperate people think is actually a safe passage. And then they end up on this boat and they realize that this is actually a very, very dangerous trip. That is why I'm insisting so much on making sure that the boats don't leave the coast in the first place. That's why we're working with Turkey and with the Turkish Coast Guard. That's the way to actually save lives.
Let's talk then about a way that you might be working with the UK. Our viewers, many of them will have heard of the Elgin marbles or the Parthenon sculptures that you call them the Parthenon sculptures because they were brought to this country in the 19th century by Lord Elgin, who was a British diplomat at the time. Now, here are the ones in the British Museum. There they are in their home in Athens. So at the moment, they're not together. You've said for a long time, Greece has said for a long time that they would very much like to have them back. Now, where do you think they look better?
I think the answer is very clear. They do look better in the Acropolis Museum, a state-of-the-art museum that was built for that purpose. And again, this is not a question of returning artifacts whose ownership we question. We feel that these sculptures belong to Greece and that they were essentially stolen. But this is not, in my mind, an ownership question. This is a reunification argument. Where can you best appreciate what is essentially one monument? I mean, it's as if I told you that you would cut the Mona Lisa in half, and you would have half of it at the Louvre and half of it at the British Museum, do you think your viewers would appreciate the beauty of the painting in such a way? Well, this is exactly what happened with the Parthenon sculptures, and that is why we keep lobbying for a deal that would essentially be a partnership between Greece and the British Museum, but which would allow us to return the sculptures to Greece and have people appreciate them in their original setting.
Now, you said you were confident if you were re-elected, you have been re-elected, that the marbles would return to Greece. So are you confident now that there will be a deal? You got a hotline to George Osborne,
well,
the boss of the British Museum?
What I can tell you is that I would hope that we have not made as much progress as I would like in the negotiations. But again, I'm a patient man, and we've waited for hundreds of years, and I will persist in these discussions.
Do you think you'll be able to do it on your time frame?
I would hope so, yes. I was just elected. I still have a full term ahead of me. It's sort of unusual in these days in Europe for prime ministers to be rewarded for the job they do. But I think we've done that. We've turned the country around. The economy is performing particularly well. We're growing much faster. I was following the previous debate about taxes and about the burden on average people. We've lowered taxes, but we've also driven up growth. So in our case, we can convincingly say that the difficult days for Greece are behind us.
And finally, on the marbles, the sculptures, the report suggesting Keir Starmer has indicated that he would give them back to Greece if he becomes the Prime Minister. Is that true? Has he told you?
I don't know. I will meet both Keir Starmer and of course, the Prime Minister tomorrow, and maybe I can let you know afterwards.
That would be wonderful. Well, it's great to have you here in the studio with us, ahead of seeing the Leader of Labour and the Prime Minister.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you very much indeed for joining us this morning. Now, lots to ponder there from the Prime Minister and also from Laura Trott, who, as the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, was discussing all sorts of things with us about tax and migration and not really wanting to admit, Christina McAnee, that some of the decisions in the autumn statement last week for Jeremy Hunt will not actually just hand everybody a big giant tax cut. What did you think?
Yeah, I mean, it's quite clear that most people won't be better off as a result of this because overall tax burden has increased on everyone in this country, and particularly sort of lower paid working people have seen their tax bill go up. Not just income tax, but the way that taxation is applied across so many other things. I mean, quite frankly, what happened last week was just like a return to austerity, Mark II. You know, they brought back Cameron, and it seems to me that they brought back the policies that Cameron had, and they just seem to be going ahead with that with no thought about what it will actually mean. And they have never grasped, the Conservatives have never grasped the fundamental principle that we certainly believe, which is investing in public services helps you grow your economy. Because without a flourishing public sector, you actually damage the private sector because people can't go to work because there isn't a decent healthcare service. They can't go to work if you haven't invested in schools. You need both to be working together.
That's all very well, but the reality is that public spending has increased in the last 20 years from 35% of the size of the economy to 47%, and the public services have never, ever been worse. Extraordinary from Laura Trott.
That's also because there's been huge...
It's because the public sector is spending the money badly.
There's been that is not true. There has been an increase. Can I finish? There has been an increase. There has been an increase in demand, as there is for most public services. Demand goes up all the time. If you look at the NHS needs around 4 to 5% per year just to stand still, and that's under when inflation was very high, it was higher than that. And when I hear governments say things like, "Oh, we've increased our spending, we're now spending more on the NHS," it's a bit like, that's true, but there's more people demanding services. So actually, the per person amount that they're given to the NHS has actually gone down.
But Richard, shouldn't you be happy about what the Tories did this week? They gave some tax cuts. That's up your street, isn't it?
Yeah, but the reality is Laura Trott was completely disingenuous there. The truth is, when you dig into the detail, the OBR has confirmed growth down from where they said it was in March. Net income per person, mainly because of the huge increase in immigration, down. Taxes up. Public sector debt up. Unemployment up. And the truth is that people on low incomes, because they've frozen the threshold for many years and for the next 5 years, it's the least well off, the lowest paid, that actually will suffer the most. That's why our policy of increasing the threshold from 12,500 to 20,000 is the one that is the right one. It will take over 6 million people from paying any income tax at all.
But you also think that migration is far, far too high, and you would cut that right back down. But without migration, as we heard at the beginning of the programme, the economy would have a sudden massive halt. Because the reason many people are here...
The economy is halted already, and we've had mass migration, which completely disproves that point. What actually the ABR has said is that mass immigration means per head incomes are down by record numbers. And this is a complete betrayal with no democratic consent. Brexit was about taking control of our borders. The government promised they would do so. They promised in the last election manifesto numbers would come down from 200,000. They've over tripled. And I think the next election will be an immigration election.
Well, that's an interesting point. Christina, do you think that's right? Will it
No.
be?
And I think the people who, like Richard, who were so passionate about Brexit, and as were lots of our members, completely lied to the British public, to be quite honest. All this about we'll take back control of our borders, complete and utter nonsense.
I'm not running the government, Christina.
I know you're not. I didn't say you were. I said people like you who sold Brexit to the British public on totally false premises that they would somehow magically be able to take back control of their borders, when in actual fact, if you look at what's happened, there's actually more people are going back to the EU than coming here, and actually immigration is now coming from all parts of the country, all parts of the world, not actually.
So I want to bring you two hammer and tongs. You're obviously having a great time at it, but I want to bring Alistair in because you run a big company, and while there's always political debate about the right decisions that have been taken, the wrong decisions have been taken, in terms of your business, your sector in energy, people's bills might be going up again, the energy cap's just gone up, and we know that there are huge sort of log jams in getting big energy projects through. The government always says they want to speed up planning, but we've heard so many times about the difficulties in getting it done. What's the biggest barrier for you at the moment?
Consenting, as you said, is obviously a huge barrier for us in terms of it can take 10 plus years to get a wind farm built, and a lot of that time, or the majority of that time, is spent in consenting.
10 years.
10 plus years. So we're building the world's biggest offshore wind farm at Dogger Bank. We originally got the seabed for that in 2009. It'll complete in 2026. So therefore, getting through that consenting is a massive thing. We need to roughly double what we've either got built or building at the moment in terms of offshore wind by 2030 to hit the targets. So therefore, getting that consenting done is right. Just going back to what the Chancellor said, it was at least very positive that he offered tax incentives for investing in terms of full expensing.
So that was a big business tax cut that was there, a genuine cut.
And that's going to help with growth, with jobs, and with attracting companies like ours. We've got 20 plus billion to spend over the next few years, and many other companies to invest. There's a great market in this country for things like offshore wind, for flexible thermal, and what we need to do is make sure that we get the investment coming in by improving that consenting process.
It's interesting you mentioned that, and it's COP, the big climate conference next week. I think you're going off to that big meeting. The Conservatives have been criticised quite a lot in the last few months for backsliding, actually, on some of their commitments in this area. The Prime Minister slowing down various of the net zero commitments. Do you feel that in your sector, that the government isn't quite as enthusiastic as they used to be?
I've certainly seen some of those statements. I think from a business perspective, what we've seen, even though things like internal combustion engines, there was some rowing back to 2035 to allow the public more time to adjust to that, and also with heat pumps. The key thing has been about investment in networks. What we heard in that same speech was an acceleration of network investment, which is needed to enable any of this to happen. And I still see the incentives there. What the Chancellor said as well backed that up. So from a business perspective, I think we're still seeing this government move forward, and it's still got hopefully another year or so when it can make a lot of difference.
OK, we'll see what happens at COP. We might discuss that next week, because it's always a big, important meeting for environmental leaders and politicians from all over the world. Richard, just as you're here, I'm sure some of our viewers have been watching with interest your pal, Nigel Farage, in the celebrity jungle in Australia.
In many ways?
Well, you might use that word. Look away from the screen, perhaps, if people are worrying about things being revealed too much. But I just wonder, in terms of the politics of where you and he are at, you know, at the beginning, a few minutes ago, you're talking a good game about how you're going to play into the next election. But at the last set of local elections, you only got 6 seats.
Look, the reality is that we are going to stand everywhere in England, Scotland and Wales.
Every single constituency.
Every single seat. People think we're going to do a deal with the Tories. Absolutely not. We're going to punish them for breaking Britain. They need punishing. They've failed. They need completely and utterly ousting. And let me tell you, when Nigel gets back from the jungle, and given all the stuff that he's been eating and drinking, goodness me, he might need a couple of days off, but he will be absolutely furious, as are millions of people up and down the country, about these huge mass immigration numbers that's changing the nature of our country. It's making us poorer financially, and it's making us poorer culturally.
Is he going to come back and try and take your job, Richard?
Well, I've always said I want as much help as possible, but I'm a bit more ambitious. I'd rather like the idea of President Farage. Maybe you could have President Farage and President Trump.
Well,
that'll
that's
wind
a whole
few people
debate,
up.
and I can see, Christina, you're fizzing
when
there.
I hear people saying things like that it will affect our country culturally, and I've heard you say this before, I've heard other people, I've heard Mick Farage say it as well. I don't even know what that means, because we are a country where people come from all over the world, our background. I'm the grandchild of migrants from Ireland. And my culture is probably very different from yours. I'm pretty certain it's an appalling way to turn things into a culture war in this country.
David Cameron, Dame Louise Casey, they all said that multiculturalism has failed. We should live and operate under one single British culture.
Richard,
there is no one single British culture.
Briefly, and we must move on.
But I want you to answer, Richard,
I want you to answer this question. What do you mean by saying our culture is...
I think that sense of Britishness, who we are, our heritage, our history, our Christian values and ethos, that is the base of our single British culture, and that's what we want people to unify under. We welcome smart, sensible levels of immigration, but mass immigration, people living in silos, different cultures, is not good for our country.
This is like harking back to the 1940s or 1950s or something.
We must move on, but we will come back to you both
nonsense.
at the end of the programme. I'm sure there's not going to be unity between you two on the panel, but it is great to hear a lively debate on the programme. And let's stick with that theme of migration we've been talking about. Let's speak to Darren Jones, who is the Labour Party's Chief Secretary to the Treasury, the man with the giant calculator for Keir Starmer. He joins us from Bristol. Hello, Darren Jones. Keir Starmer said that net migration was shockingly high. So what would the right level be?
Well, he said that because, of course, the numbers of work visas that have gone out in the last data set are much, much higher than normal. And so the question is, why is that much higher than normal?
No, our question was, what would a reasonable level be?
One of them. Well, the normal level is a couple of 100,000 a year, but it depends on the needs in the economy. And that's why the really important question is, if there are lots of vacancies in the economy, why have we got people who are out of work in the UK who should be able to access training and skills and access the jobs that exist in their local area? And that's why this is an abnormal set of numbers. It's an abnormally high number of work visas, especially into the health and social care system, which reflects problems in the way that the NHS is being run by the government.
And we've been discussing that already, and thank you for dealing with a slight delay on the line there. But you mentioned a couple of 100,000 as being a normal figure. So if Labour wins the election, should people then expect that you would be looking to set immigration levels at around about a couple of 100,000 a year as a normal kind of level?
Well, the Conservatives have tried to set targets and caps and failed every single year whilst they've had them. What we have to do is make sure that where there are problems, and the prime example here is the health and social care system, that we're getting to the root cause of the problem where we don't have sufficient labour availability locally here in the UK. And that's for two reasons in the National Health Service. One is because we need a proper NHS workforce plan, which my colleague Wes Streeting, the Shadow Health Secretary, has set out in detail. But the second is because we do need to improve the productivity of our public services so that they're more efficient, so that you don't need as many people in order to be able to run them. And that's why ultimately we're relying on a lot of overseas labour to come in and keep the show on the road. And we're very grateful for their contribution, but it's actually reflective of underlying problems in our public services that need modernising.
But how quickly, though, do you think, if you win the next election, you could make a difference to that? You've outlined the exceptional circumstances that have led to the numbers being so high, but how fast could you make a change if you win the election?
Well, there's some immediate things that we can do. That's why we've said that we will close the non-dom tax status and put over £1 billion to support overtime payments in the National Health Service to get through the backlog, which is still very, very large and increasing since the COVID pandemic. But that's a short-term issue. The reason Keir Starmer talks about mission-oriented government and an end to sticking plaster politics is because I have to be very frank with you, it's going to take time to fix some of these problems, because after 13 years of the Conservatives in government, we have deep structural problems in our country.
So how quickly then do you
economy,
think you could make a difference to the immigration numbers? Do you think that the business of getting migration to what you described as a normal level of a couple of 100,000 a year, would that be something Labour would hope to achieve in the first term of government if you win?
I think we probably would hope to do that, yes, but we've talked about a decade of national renewal, not because we're being presumptuous about this election or indeed the next one, but because we think the deep structural problems that we've been left from the Conservatives after the last 13 years is going to take time to fix, and it's going to take time to turn around. But the one thing you can be sure of is that after 13 years of the Conservatives in government, they've created these problems and they don't have the energy or the ideas to fix them, and we in the Labour Party will if we get the chance to serve the country.
Well, we want to talk about your policies rather than your criticisms of the government, but let's talk about how you would act on public spending. Now, as the man with the calculator, the Chief Secretary to the Treasury shadow, you've already mentioned it's going to be tough, it's going to be tight, but you backed the Tories' tax cuts they announced this week. The implication of backing those tax cuts is that you back a squeeze on public spending that's been penciled in to pay for them. So where do you think in government money could be cut?
Well, let's be clear, there was a headline tax cut in national insurance this week, which we do support because the tax burden on working people is the highest it has been for many decades. Families are on average spending £4,000 a year more in tax. They've got a couple hundred quid back now from the national insurance cut, and that's welcome, but it's really taking with one hand once you've already, giving with one hand once you've already taken a lot more money with the other hand. But the broader question there is we've got one other budget coming up in February, March time next year. We need to see what the final books are before we go into the next election, and we will set out that detail in our manifesto once we've had the chance to see what the inheritance would be at the point of the next election. There's still more damage that the Conservatives could do to the country.
But you spend your life looking at this stuff. It is your job to look carefully at government spending. Can you name one part of the public sector where you think cuts could, perhaps should be made?
Well, there are things, we call them switch spends. If you're referring to my time with the calculator and the Treasury team, there are things where we've already identified that there is things that the Conservatives currently spend money on not very effectively, that we think we could spend more effectively to solve problems, especially in the short term. One example of that actually is the asylum backlog, given that we've been talking about migration figures today, where there's been an underspend in certain budgets that we think we can spend on recruiting more senior caseworkers to make decisions more quickly. Another example, the capital budgets on school buildings had not been being spent very effectively, and yet we know we've got these problems with the RAC issue, with the safety of our schools. We would reprioritise those budgets to make sure that those issues are being dealt with more quickly. So there's a whole host of things that we'd be able to do, but as I say, I can't give you the kind of full bells and whistles answer because we just don't know what the accounts are that we would be inheriting at the next election.
And what
until
about
the
that 28
next budget
billion
has concluded, which we think will be in February or March.
What about that 28 billion that you've previously said you would spend a year on green investment by the end of the Parliament? Now, our colleagues in BBC News had a report that actually that might not happen by the end of the next Parliament after all. Are you committed to doing that or not?
Yes, we are committed to it, subject to our fiscal rules, and the one that's most relevant to this question is that we will get national debt falling as a percentage of the size of the economy by the next Parliament. But we're confident we can do both, and I'll just quickly explain why. One, where we are investing alongside business to have more secure energy supplies so that we can lower bills for people at home, where we're investing alongside business to create new jobs in the country, those activities will stimulate economic growth, which means that it will be easier to be able to get a return from those investments to pay off that debt and to get debt reducing as a percentage of the size of the economy. And the second thing to say is what we have said is we're going to ramp up to £28 billion a year towards the end of the next Parliament, because it will take time to spend that money effectively, and we will only spend it effectively, but also because after the Liz Truss quasi-Kwarteng period in government, the cost of borrowing for the country is much higher than it was in the past, and we will only borrow to invest alongside business where it's prudent to do so and subject to our fiscal rules.
Darren Jones, thank you very much indeed for joining us this morning. Good to have you on the programme, introducing the concept of the switch spend. That might be something we hear more about in the years to come. Now, are you a Whovian? You might think that politics and the news sometimes takes us to some weird and not so wonderful places, but Doctor Who fans will know well that it's back on our screens. Not just with David Tennant to mark the incredible 60th anniversary of the epic saga, but with the legend that is Catherine Tate. And she is also starring in a spooky new show, soon to be in London's West End. But I had to ask her what it was like to be part of a British phenomenon.
I don't believe in destiny, but if destiny exists, it is heading for Donna Noble.
Your fight is with me!
I don't know if I can save your life this time.
David's a massive Doctor Who fan and knows everything about it. I don't, and I didn't. I remember Dr. Tom Baker with his long scarf, and I kind of remember it, but I didn't used to watch it.
So you're not one of the mega aficionados, the Whovians as they call themselves?
I'm not, although I have to say I am so... it's amazing to me that I'm part of this sort of massive conglomerate of an amazing collection of experiences, I suppose, you know, televisual experiences, and that a character I play is, you know, sort of staked her claim in this story.
So has it sort of happened by accident in a way?
Well, I guess it did, because and I don't still to this day I don't know why Russell thought it was a good idea to put me in it. I'm delighted that he did, and it will always be 100%. It will always be, I'm sure, the best job I've ever had.
Really?
For 100%. I think David and I both feel that. It's 100% the best job we've ever had. And to get another bite of the cherry, extraordinary.
Sometimes I think there's something missing. Like I had something lovely, and it's gone.
I've got this friend called Donna Noble. If she remembers me, she will die.
We've got a Martian in the shed!
Something entered this world.
Who are they?
In terms of being scared of things, what you're working on now in this theatre is something very scary. I mean, a story from the 70s, a real live story about poltergeists and ghosts and spirits. Why do you think people pay to have the bejesus scared out of them? What is it about horror?
As soon as the lights go down, the audience, they're already like this. They're already like that. And I think, I don't know, I suppose it's just something we want to be affected by. And it's the unknown. We can't prove it, whether it's real or whether it's not. And I think there's something tantalising about that, and I guess that's what's drawing people to it.
So if people aren't familiar with the story then, what's it about?
Well, it is about a real family in the 70s who moved into a house that the previous resident had died in, and they claimed that they were being haunted. And their strange goings-on were reported. The children were being affected by it. Furniture was moving, there was noise everywhere, and then suddenly crazy things started happening. It gripped the nation at the time. It was on the news, you know, it was on the front page of the newspapers. It was the BBC did a documentary about it. But it divided people, because some people were, you know, very much saying, oh, this is terrible, and some people going, absolutely not, how can you even believe it? And I think it affected the family in a way that went way beyond what was going on in the house.
Do you believe it?
Do I believe it? I have to, I think, because of the story I'm trying to tell, what they're trying to tell, I have to hold the ambiguity, because no one can say if it's real or if it's not. I have my own theory about it.
Go on then.
But I don't think it's useful to say. I don't think it's useful to say, because also I don't know. You know, I don't know if it happened. But what I know is, if something was happening and my children were being affected and it got out of hand, and then people then started to have opinions about that and judgments about that, I know as a mother I'd want to protect my children. So Who can say? Who can say? And I know that the lady, as I understand it, whose character I play, the mother of the children, I believe she lived the rest of her life absolutely claiming, you don't know what happened, you can't tell us what was true or what was not. So.
And do you think then that class and snobbery and not listening to a woman came into the story?
I think absolutely. I think if this family that was being, haunted or possessed or whatever, I think if they hadn't been a working class family in a council house with a single mother, I think the story might have gone very different. I don't think they would have been taken advantage of the way they were. Because they were, I feel from what I see, they were taken advantage of by everyone. Look, we're doing a play about them now. It carries on. I hope we're not taking advantage of them, because we are very much saying this is based, we're not saying it's based on, we're saying it's inspired by true events, which is different. We're not saying this is what happened and this is what they were like. We're saying we've heard this story and it's inspired us to do this rendition of it. But yeah, I absolutely think it's about class.
You've had lots of different experiences in the industry as a stand-up, as an actress, as someone on TV, and now again on stage. In your experience, has how women are treated in the industry changed over your time, or do you think women are sometimes still treated badly or overlooked or not given the credit they deserve?
The Me Too movement happened so quickly. It felt like an oil tanker. Instead of gradually going, the redressing of the balance, which was so needed and so overdue, it kind of went like that, and it kind of created a bit of a backlash. But 100%, we're getting there. It's getting better, but it's ingrained in our culture for women to be sidelined and spoken down to, and slightly ignored. The entertainment industry, I think, is responding well, as I hope everywhere else is. But it's a work in progress, I'd say.
Catherine, thank you so much for speaking to us today.
Okay.
Thank you. Queen of the TARDIS, Catherine Tate. And lots of you have been in touch this morning about what we've been discussing, money and migration. Gail Waters said in an email, the problem with immigration is that there aren't the services necessary to support the numbers. Tracy Turnbull told us from 2010, the Conservatives have put taxes up and up. I think they need to be out. But David Johnson says Laura Trott was being so disingenuous. Illegal immigration is a small number of the overall figure. Always strong views on migration, and I know we'll be talking about it in the months to come as we head towards the general election, whenever it's going to be. Who is a Doctor Who fan who's been watching?
I was in my youth. But
oh, not anymore?
Well, no, I still am, and it's remarkable. But, it's incredible to have lasted 60 years. I still remember John Pertwee.
Christina, you a fan?
David Tennant, by far the best Doctor Who, and I'm so pleased he's coming back. It's just fantastic.
And Alistair?
They've stolen both my lines. But I can tell you a story. In Blackpool, about 50 years ago, I hid behind my mother when the Dalek came out when I went to see the exhibition. So and I still remember that vividly, the first time a Dalek came for me.
They are quite scary,
They
actually.
really are.
They really are.
They
look a bit like the robot cameras in this studio. So I think before they come for us, we'll say goodbye to the three of you. Thank you so much for your insights and chat this morning. It's been a very lively discussion. Christina, Richard and Alistair with us, as we've been spending 60 minutes trying to work out if our politicians are being as honest as they possibly could be when it comes to migration and money. The answer? Well, perhaps not quite. They all want to tell you there are too many people coming legally to the UK, but they get a bit shy when it comes to saying exactly how they would change it. And how tight might government cash be? They're not that keen on elaborating on that too. In a second, I'm joining up with Paddy O'Connell. There he is. Is he going to wave this morning? Can he hear us? There he is. We'll be on BBC Sounds later on with the weekend newscast. You can catch up with anything on the iPlayer, of course, later on, and Doctor Who is there too, of course. But if you just like watching the telly the old-fashioned way, I'll look forward to seeing you here next week, same time, same place. Goodbye.